Can't hear. Good morning. Is that better? Okay. Better. My name is Stacy Kopsha. I'm use she, her pronouns, and I'm a member of your board of trustees. And I welcome you here today, those joining us in the sanctuary and those online. I'm glad you're here. Longtime members and new visitors alike, you all are welcome here. We're a congregation of many beliefs, sexualities, genders, and love is the power that holds us all together. You are all welcome here just as you are. Let's see. For those of you here in the sanctuary, and if you're in need of hearing assistance devices, those are available at the back of the sanctuary. We also have large print hymnals that are available back there too. For those online, there's an online chaplain. I think it's Bob Hayes who's helping today to assist you. Let's see, on the order of service, there is a link to, or it shows our website, tahomauu.com. And if you're not signed up for our e-news, you can sign up there and it tells about all the current happenings at our church. There's a lot going on. A few highlights is that on June 9th, we'll be having a all congregational meeting shortly after the service. So I encourage every member that is able to attend. It will be multiple platforms, so you could attend online via Zoom or here in the sanctuary. There's save the date for a camping trip that David Pettit is arranging. So again, that'll be August, I think it's the weekend of the 18th at Gus Backstrom State Park near Morton, Washington. So I think it's only an hour drive. It's not too far. So stay tuned for more details on that. And let's see, there'll be an RE committee meeting next Sunday shortly after the service downstairs in the hall. Anyone's welcome to come to that too. And I think that's all I had. Scott had a few things to say, and then Chrissy Kim.
Good morning, everybody. I am here next week to lead our service, and we're going to do a service on love letters to the future. So if I have instructions, if anyone would like to join me in writing a 300-word or less love letter to the future, look for me. I'll probably have a white coffee mug later.
You beat me to that part. And Chrissy Kim, our board president, would like to say a few words.
Good morning, y'all. So we do have our congregational meeting coming up, and as part of the congregational meeting, we approve our budget. So we are trying to wrap up our pledge drive. Online, there's a folder, there's a link to the e-news, in the e-news to the folder that has all of the annual meeting documents, including the budget proposal. You will see from our bridge to the future over here, we are only at 75%. 65% of our budget goal. So when the board met just this past Thursday, we made some cuts to the budget as we could. We are still about $50,000 short. What we found out is we have about half of the pledges in that we had last year in terms of pledging units. I know that this has been a hard year. We lost Reverend Linda. We were excited to welcome Reverend Crystal. Reverend Crystal has some health issues that has kept her out of our pulpit and away from our congregation. This is not the year we intended to have. And I know that that is a disappointment for all of us. And we are still here. And we are still needed in this community, and we are still needed for each other. So I encourage you, if you haven't pledged yet, please reconsider joining us and sharing your financial contributions to make our congregation run. We are wanting to get a DRE, which is a director of religious exploration, to help support our children at halftime. Halftime, just halftime. We would love full-time, but we need to start slow, right? So we didn't want to ask, and clearly we need to start slow. So please, if you haven't submitted a pledge this year, and I know that we had some new members, And wondering if y'all thought that, hey, I just signed the membership book 2 months ago and submitted a pledge or a waiver form. It's a new fiscal year. You got to do it again, or we aren't counting on it. So please, 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 turn in those pledges and help us get to our goals. And then I will see you all at the congregational meeting, and we will figure it out together.
Thank you, Chrissy. Let's see. And what else? Oh, so welcome to join us for coffee and refreshments after the service. If you're new and would like to be approached, get a red mug, and if you're a longtime member, you can use the white or use the red one if you want a bigger beverage too. All right. And then I would like to do the land acknowledgement, that I respectfully acknowledge to you that I speak today from the land of the Coast Salish people, including the Puyallup tribal nations, land from which they were forcibly displaced. I affirm the continued sovereignty of the 574 federally recognized tribes, including the 29 here in Washington state. I support those still fighting for federal recognition. I acknowledge the theft, the violence, the trauma, and the racism that Indigenous people have experienced at the hands of our colonizers since 1492, and they continue to suffer the present day. I honor the resiliency of the Indigenous people and stand with them as they continue to fight for land, for water, sovereignty, and their very existence. Lastly, I invite you to set your phones to silent worship mode, to take a deep breath, step away from the busyness and cares of the world, and join in our service today.
Good morning. I am the Reverend Monica Jacobson-Tennesen. I use she, her pronouns, and I have terrible spring allergies this year. So forgive me as I clear my throat through our time together. Our opening words today come from my colleague, the Reverend Katie Romano Griffin. Come, let us enter into this space of hope and community. Come, let us enter into this space with our sorrows, our joys, our passion, and compassion. Come, let us enter into this space with the stories of our ancestors, for their strength and wisdom beats in our hearts. Come into this space, present to the beloved companions who move beside us. Come into this space, mindful that together we are building a future for other generations. Come into this space and let us worship.
Well, I want to start with a thank you to Reverend Monica for joining us today. She comes to us from Southwest Washington and has already been on I-5 today, and she'll be back on it again. Her normal congregation is in Pasco, and I maybe have forgotten the name already, Community Unitarian
Yes.
Church.
So my other commute is I-84.
So she knows interstates, east and north. She comes to us thanks to congregant Doug Booth, who met her in Corvallis, and recommended that she come visit us, and she has put this service together. So thank you very much. To light our chalice today, I want David Pettit to come forward and do the chore. David does just about everything here. I think third Friday potluck, camping trips. If there's food involved, David's probably involved. And the pledge drive work. So thank you, David. And now when the words come on screen, we'll do our unison reading. We light this chalice in deep respect for the mystery and the holiness of life, in honor and gratitude for those who have gone before, with love and compassion for those who dwell among us, and with hope and faith for the generations to come. For our opening hymn, we're going to sing number 51 in the gray hymnal. The words will be on screen, and Patty McPhee will be our song leader. So please rise in body or spirit. Thanks, Patty. Thanks all.
Hold us in your steady us in your steady mercy, Lady of the turning age.
I would like to invite children, youth, anybody young at heart, or at least still young enough in hips and knees to sit on the ground. Good morning. Who is this? That's fabulous. All right, we have a unicorn joining us up here as well. You do not need to identify as human to come to be part of hearing the story. You should have, but that's okay. Maybe next week. So I have a story to share with you all this morning from a UU minister whose name was David Petit. And this was adapted by my friend and colleague, the Reverend Sarah Lewis. One of the important things that Unitarian Universalists try to do is to seek the truth in love. Does that sound like an easy thing to do or a hard thing to do? A hard thing. How about those of you big kids in the chairs? Sound hard to you too? Yeah, it's pretty challenging, right? And why do we think it's hard? Do we have any ideas? Why does it sound like a hard thing to do? Why do we think it sounds hard to seek the truth in love? Not sure. It just sounds like pretty hard. Yeah. Oh, truth is pretty slippery. That's a good one. You don't know what's going to happen next. That's exactly right. So in David's story, that's what he encountered. He found things he did not know. In David's family, he was the person who knew the most about their ancestors. It had been his grandfather who knew all the stories of their ancestors, and then his father. And then when David was a grown-up, he became the person who knew the most. Over time, lots and lots of great stories about their family had been shared. And David was so proud of everything he knew about his ancestors and the things they had done. And so he decided to learn more stories and keep passing them down. And the internet made his search for records and stories much easier than it used to be. So David's grandfather, when he wanted to learn about their ancestors, he had to take vacation time from work, and he had to travel to a place where he could read the old documents in the archives. But David had the internet, so he could do a search from home. One day in 2006, David was searching online and he found a record from the 1770s. 1770s. And in that record, he found the name of one of his ancestors. And he also found out that this ancestor, who lived in Rhode Island, had 4 enslaved African people living in his house. David had never heard this story. This was a huge surprise to him. And he thought, maybe my family felt embarrassed about this, and so they stopped telling the story. And then maybe everybody forgot about it. It was also a surprise to David to even know that people had been enslaved in New England, in the north end of the colonies. He had thought people were only enslaved in the South. So he knew that there was more that he needed to learn. He needed to seek the truth in love. He learned, too, that he had an ancestor who had been captain of a ship that sailed back and forth across the Atlantic, taking people captured in Africa and forced into slavery and bringing them to North America. This was hard for David to accept, and for a while it made him feel ashamed about his family. Can you imagine how that would feel? Learning that kind of story about your family and, oh, right? That might feel really sad, or you might feel angry at your ancestors. But David was committed to seeking the truth in love. So
he learned more about his ancestor who was a ship's captain. And in fact, he decided he wanted to see with his own eyes the places his ancestor had gone. And he traveled to the places in Africa that his ancestor had sailed to. Amazingly, some of the buildings were still standing. He walked in the places his ancestor had walked. It made history come alive even more for him. And the thing that surprised David was that he began to feel different inside. The more he learned, the more he began to feel liberated from being ashamed. He knew that this was a story he needed to be able to tell truthfully, even though it was very uncomfortable. We've got a unicorn fan up here. When David got back home, he knew there was more he wanted to do. He wanted to find a person whose ancestor had been enslaved by his ancestor, because David wanted to share everything that he had been learning. And he hoped that this information might help someone else understand their own family history. So even though the life stories of African Americans were often not recorded in public records, David learned that there were ways that African Americans had kept their own records, that they had left a trail for others to follow to learn about their history. And one day, looking at those records, David found mention of an African American with the same last name as David's ancestor. He began researching him and he learned about his life, and he realized that this man he had found had been enslaved in David's ancestor's home. And then he traced that man's descendants and their descendants, and he found someone alive today. A year and a half after he first began seeking the truth, David gathered up his courage and he called a woman named Pat, who lived in New York City. And David lived in Boston, so he could travel to New York pretty easily. He didn't know how it was going to go when he called Pat. He thought maybe she would be mad at him because of what his ancestor did to her ancestor. But he knew he had some truth that he wanted to share with her. And Pat was not mad at all. Pat was really grateful that David had learned as much as he could about her ancestor and called to share what he knew. It filled in a lot of gaps that she had about her family history. Pat and David became good friends. They began to refer to each other as cousins. And they have since met other people, those who have one ancestor who enslaved someone and those who have one ancestor who was enslaved. And they have practiced having important conversations together, speaking the truth in love. Can you imagine ever having a conversation like that? You ever met somebody and you were like, wow, we're connected way in the past? What do we want to talk about now to make a good today and a good future? What started out as something that felt embarrassing and shameful for David began to feel hopeful. And this was part of taking the legacy of slavery and helping to build something new by speaking the truth together in love. And that is our story. I'd like to invite those in the center to make a love arch. Hi, it's time to go to class. Thank you for joining me this morning. Oh no, she's fine.
Good morning, everybody. Bob Hayes here, normally your chat chaplain hiding in the library. I feel so much smarter just hanging around with a bunch of books. But this is the time that we pulled together to give our offertory for the day. We all come here for different reasons. Some of us come here for a spiritual center. Some of us come here for the community. Some of us come here to bring our little people, to have them experience a wider view of life. For whatever reason, this is the time we ask that you reach into your wallets and help keep this church going. Thank you. For the parking area and also for finding housing for people that are challenged due to their beliefs. So thank you.
Gosh, thank you, Marianne. I don't know that you could have chosen better following the story that Reverend Monica brought us. That was amazing. I think of it as redemption song. Bob Marley. Wow, thank you. Let's join together a dedication of our offering. We dedicate ourselves and our offerings to the work of this congregation, weaving a tapestry of love we call community, both within and beyond these walls. And now for our meditation hymn, it's going to be number 1001 in the teal hymnal, Breaths. Please rise in body or spirit. Patty's going to lead us. Thanks, Patty.
Just go with this. Don't worry about it being perfect. Just breathe.
She says her too.
All of us. Those who have died have never left earth. The dead are not under the earth. They are in the rustling trees. They are in the groaning woods. They are in the crying grass. They are in the moaning rocks. The dead are not under the earth. So listen more often to things than to beings. Listen more often to things than to beings. The ancestors' breath, the fire's voice is heard. 'Tis the ancestors' breath in the voice of the waters. Those who have died have never left. The dead have not met with the living. They are in the woman's breast. They are in the wailing child. They are with us in our homes. They are with us in this crowd. The dead have a pact with the living. So listen more often to things than to being. Listen more often to things than to being. It is the ancestors' breath. When the morning's voice is heard, 'tis the ancestors' breath in the voice of the waters.
Thank you, Patty. Thank you, everyone. Ancestry is complicated, including singing about it. Our first reading today comes from Embracing Rootedness and Radical Genealogy by Aurora Levins Morales. She writes, Raícism, from raíces or roots, is the practice of rooting ourselves in the real, concrete histories of our people, our families, our local communities, our ethnic communities. It is radical genealogy, history made personal. It is a keeping of accounts. Its intent is to pierce the immense, mind-deadening denial that permeates daily life, that drowns our deepest grief and horror about the founding and ongoing atrocities of racism, class, and patriarchy in endless chatter about trivialities. Oppression buries the actual lives of real and contradictory people in crude generalizations of bigotry and punishes us for not matching the caricature, refusing all evidence of who we actually are in defiance of its tidy categories. Oppression is a blunt instrument used for bashing not only our dangerous complexities, but also the ancient and permanent fact of our involvement with each other. Raícism, or rootedness, is the choice to bear witness to our specific contradictory historical identities in relationship to one another. It is an accounting of the debts and assets we have inherited and acknowledging the precise nature of that inheritance is an act of spiritual and political integrity. Here ends the reading. In 2020, I attended a training at which the facilitator said, casually, "Peace is not the absence of conflict. Peace is the presence of justice." She said it like, "Oh yeah, of course." She went on to explain that what is necessary does not always feel peaceful if we've been taught that peace means calm and untroubled. Peace as the presence of justice often requires us to move through chaos and tension, and yes, sometimes some conflict. And I remembered this past winter when I began thinking about my own genealogy in a new way. As a white American, I have spent the past 10 or so years coming to understand more and more about what it means to be white in this country. I have learned about the privileges that I get from my racial identity, some of which I didn't even notice until I learned enough to start looking for them. About the idea that whiteness in and of itself was created and has been a moving target throughout history, often for very arbitrary reasons. Maybe you've seen books with titles like How the Irish Became White. My heritage is about a quarter Irish. Those ancestors are pretty pale, phenotypically speaking, but we're not always considered white. And when I looked at history, and I looked at the big movements, and I looked at the small moments, and I thought about my ancestry, I did it through the idea that I had that all of my ancestors had arrived on the North American continent in the 19th century. So yes, they were definitely part of a land grab that pushed many indigenous Americans off the lands that they had stewarded since time immemorial. And yes, my ancestors almost certainly were taught and said and did racist things. But some little part of me said, I have some distance from some of the really uncomfortable parts of US history. Well, this past winter, I started undertaking some genealogical research. And at that same time, someone in my social media feed shared about a class called Before We Were White, aimed at people with European ancestry who wanted to dig into their ancestors' life experiences as part of grounding our anti-racism work today. And I was like, yes, that is perfect. I want to learn about who my ancestors were before they were white. I want to teach my daughter more of the full history of our people. And I want to ground ourselves in reclaiming those identities as part of being builders of true multicultural community. And I found some surprises. So it turns out that not all of my ancestors arrived from Europe in the 19th century. On each side of my family, I have one great grandparent whose descendants go back to an arrival on North America in the 1600s. So I gave up all my comfortable distance. And I want to pause here to acknowledge that this is another kind of white privilege that I am learning about. My ancestors were the kinds of people whose lives got recorded in ways that are still preserved and easily accessible today. Now, if you go back past a certain point, it's only the male ancestors because patriarchy. But there are still family lines that I can trace because they are white family lines. Genealogical research can be much harder if you are researching ancestors who are Black or Indigenous or Latinx or Asian or any number of other identities that were not regarded as worthy of record in a white dominant society. As I traced one of my ancestral lines back, I found many generations of people living in North Carolina. I kind of knew there were people in North Carolina. I did not know one of them was a Confederate soldier during the Civil War. And then I found out that his grandfather, who was also from North Carolina, had fought as an American soldier in the Revolutionary War. And then I found that his grandfather, who lived in Massachusetts, fought in what was called King Philip's War. King Philip's War was called that because the leader of the Pokanoket Wampanoag people, Metacom, had taken the name Philip for the purpose of interacting with the English colonists. In 1675, the English colonists had been in armed conflict with the Wampanoag in what is now considered to be the deadliest war in colonial American history. It took tremendous amounts of life on both sides. So an unexpected part of history had become personal to me. I had never guessed that I was connected to this history and these stories, some of which I had learned during the years I served a congregation and lived in southeastern Massachusetts. I remember going to museums and reading placards about King Philip's War and sort of shaking my head at the things people had done. I didn't know that my ancestor was part of that. It was not comfortable to learn this. And I wondered how I could have not known. But I was taking this class, and the instructors of Before We Were White pointed out that white Americans are encouraged to forget about all kinds of uncomfortable things. We are encouraged to forget where our ancestors came from. We're encouraged to forget some of the life-giving things about their past, like how they connected to their land and their communities. We are encouraged to forget the harms they endured and the harms they caused. And I pause here again to note that while white people are encouraged to forget, many other people have had their heritages intentionally erased or destroyed and even criminalized. And in some ways, this push to disconnect from heritage makes us all really good consumers for capitalism. If you don't know how your ancestors lived their lives, if you don't know that you are deeply interconnected with your neighbors, you'll probably be willing to just order the next thing off Amazon that seems like it might solve your problem, right? Anybody else ever done that? Gosh, life is hard. I bet the internet will sell me something to fix it. And in some ways, this disconnection is really about keeping us separate so we can't make a better world together. The concept of whiteness in America was created to keep lower class laborers in the colonies from joining together to protest their exploitation by the wealthy. These laborers were British, They were other Europeans, they were Africans, they were indigenous North Americans, and those who had the power and the money did not want all these people realizing that together they had the power. For example, in the earliest days of the Maryland colony, British and African laborers worked, ate, and formed relationships together. They lived under similar conditions. They had the same opportunities when they were free, whether they were free from a term of enslavement or a term of indenture. In other words, any man, because patriarchy, remember, any man who had worked off his contract became able to vote, able to enslave others, able to marry a person of his choosing, regardless of their national origin. African men at that time could and did vote, could and did enslave others, and could and did marry British women, until in 1681, Maryland passed a law declaring that white women could not marry Black men, and therefore created the legal category of white for the first time in North America. More laws were passed to create and enforce divisions. The prohibition of free Black men from holding public office. The prohibition of free Black men from holding guns. And, buckle up for this one, the requirement that when white men completed their indenture and became free, they had to be given a gun and ammunition. A legal requirement. These laws did not really do anything to change the economic status of white laborers relative to the wealthy leaders of the colony. White and Black laborers still had much more in common than they had different. But what the laws did was to create a white identity that became more relevant and more important to the laborers than the European identities that they had. It separated white laborers from Black and indigenous laborers. And if you want your mind blown further about this, you can look up Jacqueline Batalora's work. She's really dug in to how these early laws of the colonies divided people in a convincing manner that reverberates today. Jacqueline Batalora. So in this way, the laboring class, who were the vast majority of people in colonial Maryland, were given reasons to mistrust each other. And this discouraged them from working together to change the way the wealthy profited from everyone's labor. It is a powerful illustration of what we had learned in this class. One of our instructors, Chris Crass, who is a Unitarian Universalist racial justice advocate, said, "Many of you came into this class with a lens of liberal anti-racism. So tell me if this sounds familiar. You've been taught, gosh, throughout history, white people have been jerks a lot of the time. It would be great if we could learn to be less jerky." And people nodded, yes. He said, well, what we really need to work on is radical anti-racism. Radical anti-racism says we need to unlearn the trick that told us that we were so separate and so different from each other. We need to see that although racism, of course, hurts people of color much more than it hurts white people, it hurts white people too. And it is life-giving for all of us to unlearn it. And when I heard that, it helped me imagine some of my ancestors as people who had been tricked into falling for this idea of whiteness. Not bad people, but people who were fooled and gave up a bit of who they were to feel that their lives might be a little better than the lives of their neighbors. Part of my work now to create the presence of justice is to unlearn that tricking and that separation. A second reading from Aurora Levins Morales. Taking full responsibility for the legacy of our relationships is empowering and radical. Guilt and denial and the defensive pull to avoid blame require immense amounts of energy, and they are profoundly immobilizing. Giving them up can be a great relief. Deciding that we are, in fact, accountable frees us to act. Acknowledging our ancestors' participation in the oppression of others, and she says, this is ultimately true of everyone if you really dig. And deciding to balance the accounts on their behalf leads to greater integrity and less shame, less self-righteousness and more righteousness, more humility and compassion, and a sense of proportion. And at the same time, she says, uncovering the credit side of the accounts, not the suffering, but the solidarity, persistence, love, hard work, creativity, and soul of our forebears is also an obligation. We are responsible for carrying that forward into our own time and for calling on our kin to do likewise. For people committed to liberation, to claim descent from the perpetrators is a renewal of faith in human beings. If slavers, invaders, committers of genocide, and inquisitors can someday beget abolitionists, resistance fighters, healers, and community builders, then anyone can transform an inheritance of privilege or victimization into something more fertile than either. Here ends the second reading. I so appreciate Aurora Levins Morales naming that looking at our true ancestry involves acknowledging our ancestors' participation in the oppression of others. And it's ultimately true of everyone if you really dig. So often we find history told in binaries. Sometimes we hear that old chestnut, well, the white people knew best how to use the land and the resources and in fact the other people, and so they took over everything and optimized it. Have you heard that one? Right? We've also probably heard, well, the white people were awful and they came and ruined what were otherwise perfect and ideal societies of people of color. You heard that one? Yep. Neither one of those is true. It is important to be able to say that most people and most communities are a mix of flaws and virtues. Most people are focused on taking care of themselves and their family or their community. And it is important to see how the circumstances of their times and the breadth or narrowness of their definition of community impacted how they acted. So that family line of mine with the man who fought in King Philip's War and killed Wampanoag people, the first person in that line to arrive in North America was a man named Ralph Hill. Ralph was born in England and he sailed to the Massachusetts colony in 1638. And later, he and 14 other men petitioned the colonial leadership for permission to start a new town. In 1654, they started the town of Billerica, Massachusetts. Billerica was apparently very notable in colonial Massachusetts because the land was the most equitably divided of any of the Pilgrim and Puritan settlements. Now, Ralph and I almost certainly do not agree about the autonomy of women. And Ralph was definitely part of colonial land theft from Massachusetts and Wampanoag and other indigenous peoples of the Northeast. But I can find a bit of Ralph's behavior that I agree with. Because among the people with whom he did know that he was in community, it seems he wanted to be fair. That is a heritage that I can carry forward as I keep expanding the circle of those with whom I am in community. And here's a little more I think Ralph and I would agree on. In his will, he left some of his property to the town to create a burying ground, acknowledging his relationship not only with the larger community, but even with those no longer living. And today in Billerica, Massachusetts, there is a hiking park known as the Ralph Hill Conservation Area. I wish I had known this when I lived in Massachusetts. It is 61 acres of forest, wetlands, and rock formations along the Concord River. It has a beaver pond and nesting areas conserved for birds native to the region. And I really would have liked to go there because I think Ralph and I might have in common a respect for the natural world. Thinking about Ralph and all these other hills in my ancestry, thinking about what I might carry forward and where we certainly differ from each other, grounds me in a few things. First, it reminds me that I have to have the humility to know that whatever I'm doing today that I'm pretty sure is progressive, somebody 100 years or 400 years from now is going to be like, really, Monica? That's the best you could do? Really? Ralph helped divide land up equitably. But if I could talk to him today, I would say, Ralph, come on. Women are definitely people. And stop stealing land in order to divide it up. And what will my descendants 400 years from now have to say about me and my behavior? I can't believe she drove a gasoline-powered car. Who does that? And second, thinking about all these ancestors who fell for this trick of systemic racism, all these people who got conned into thinking that being white and going along with the system was the best thing for their family. Well, the best legacy I can create for them now is to live in true solidarity, as deep and as wide as I can make it. My ancestors were people who left Europe and came to North America seeking safety, freedom, and a good life for their children. They got trapped by a premise that said, if you learn to be white and you forget all that other stuff about who you were in Europe and you forget that you and your neighbors have a lot in common, you will be entitled to a life that's just a little bit better than the one your neighbors have. They were part of terrible wrongs, sometimes as passive beneficiaries of the system, and sometimes as deliberate acts. But I understand wanting safety and freedom and a good life for your children. So like this movement from understanding peace as the absence of conflict to peace as the presence of justice, these are the movements I am embracing. I want safety, the safety of a society that cares for everyone. The safety of a society that offers healthcare and housing and respect for all people, exactly as they are, and for the natural world. I want the freedom for each and every person to express their truest self without suffering stigma or prejudice. And I want a good life for my child. I want her to know the complicated truths of her ancestry. I want her to hold those truths with compassion and empathy. And I want her to live in community and solidarity with others. As I get further into this work, I'm grateful to know that there are organizations like Coming to the Table, an organization that supports, quote, all who wish to acknowledge and heal wounds from racism that is rooted in the United States history of slavery. Their work is about creating relationships, including those that they call linked descendants, people like Pat and David in our story, where one ancestor enslaved another ancestor. So wherever you are, in connecting with your ancestry, whether you know lots and lots of details or maybe some broad strokes, or maybe that's not even where your attention is right now, wherever you are, I hope you'll join me in this life-giving work of making who and how we are now into the realization of the best hopes of those who came before. Let us take our inheritances and transform them into something more. Please join me in a moment of intention, reflection, meditation, whatever is your practice as we hold this invitation together.
For our closing hymn, we're going to sing number 16 in the gray hymnal. Patty will lead us. "'Tis a gift to be simple." Please rise in body or spirit.
Tis a gift to be simple, tis a gift to be free, tis a gift to come down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in this place, the right will be valley, applause, and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to go and to end, we shan't be ashamed to turn away our light, and turning, we come round right.
We close this morning with these words from Adam Slate. Be kind, be brave, be just, be merciful, be hopeful. This is how we keep the chalice flame burning until we are together to light it anew.
Our chalice extinguishing words will appear on screen. I do believe. Here we go. Join me. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. All right, and now if you'll join me in the closing blessing song.